Good evening, time traveler. Get comfortable, take a deep breath, and prepare for a journey into one of history's most romanticized cultures. Tonight, we're going to experience what it was really like to live as a Viking in Scandinavia during the Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1060 CE. But forget the images of fearless warriors sailing off to glory, horned helmets gleaming in the sun, and noble explorers discovering new worlds. That's not our story tonight. Our journey takes us to a Viking farmstead in Norway around 950 CE, when the Viking Age was at its height. This isn't the Hollywood version of muscular warriors feasting in mead halls and dying gloriously in battle. This is the reality: the endless agricultural labor in a climate where growing season was brutally short, the constant threat of starvation when harvests failed, the bone-chilling cold of Scandinavian winters without modern heating, and the understanding that most Vikings never raided anyone. They spent their lives struggling to survive in one of Europe's harshest environments. Before we begin, leave me a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. And if there's another historical topic you'd like me to explore, let me know. Your suggestions shape these journeys. Now, let's step into a Viking longhouse and discover what daily life was really like when survival was the main adventure. Your life as a Viking began with the fundamental fact that you lived in Scandinavia, a region of long, dark winters, short growing seasons, and marginal agricultural land. Norway, Sweden, and Denmark offered different challenges, but all shared climate that made farming difficult and survival uncertain. If you were born in Norway, you likely lived in a narrow valley between steep mountains with limited arable land and a growing season that might last only 4 months. If you were in Sweden, you might have slightly more farmland but faced equally harsh winters. Denmark's flatter terrain made agriculture easier, but winter was still brutal and growing season short. The farmstead where you lived was the basic unit of Viking society. This wasn't a village with many families, but rather an isolated farm, a longhouse where your extended family lived, surrounded by outbuildings for animals, storage, and workshops. The longhouse itself was the center of your universe, a single long building, perhaps 50 to 100 feet in length, 15 to 20 feet wide, with timber or sod walls and a turf roof. It was dark, smoky, crowded, and smelled perpetually animals, unwashed bodies, cooking, and smoke. Inside the longhouse, there was essentially one large room with a central hearth, the fire pit that provided heat, light, and cooking facility. Smoke rose through a hole in the roof, though much of it lingered in the upper reaches of the building, blackening the rafters and making breathing difficult. On either side of the central hearth were raised platforms where the family slept, sat, worked. Privacy didn't exist in any meaningful sense. You lived, worked, slept, gave birth, died, and did everything else in close proximity to a dozen or more family members. The division of labor was strict and began in childhood. If you were born male, your future was farming, fishing, occasional trading, and possibly, but not necessarily, raiding. The romantic image of the Viking warrior applies to a small minority of Vikings, mostly younger sons without inheritance prospects, or men from families wealthy enough to equip them for expeditions. Most men spent their lives farming marginal land, tending animals, and fighting constant battle against climate and soil that grudged every harvest. If you were born female, your life was unrelenting domestic labor. You wove cloth from wool and linen, a process that consumed enormous amounts of time. You spun thread constantly, literally, from the moment you could hold a spindle, which was probably around age 5 or 6. The spindle and distaff were so associated with women's work that they symbolized femininity itself. You prepared food, preserved food for winter, churned butter, made cheese, brewed ale, maintained the fire, hauled water, and managed the household's complex economy of production and storage. Your day began before dawn, regardless of season, though in winter that meant waking in pitch darkness at what might be 9 or 10 a.m. by modern clock time, since the sun barely rose at all in the far north during winter solstice. In summer, dawn came at 3 or 4 a.m., and you worked until sunset at 10
Sleep
or 11
was
p.m.
squeezed
into whatever hours darkness and exhaustion allowed. The work was relentless and seasonal. In spring, you prepared fields, plowing with a yard, a simple scratch plow, pulled by oxen if you were wealthy enough to own them, or by hand if you weren't. You sowed barley, oats, and rye, the grains that could tolerate the short growing season. You tended vegetable gardens with cabbage, onions, peas, and beans. You cared for animals that had survived winter on drastically reduced rations and were weak and vulnerable. Summer was frantic race against time. Hay had to be cut and dried for winter fodder, absolutely critical, since your survival depended on animals surviving winter. If hay harvest failed or got wet and rotted, animals died. And without animals, you couldn't plow, couldn't have dairy products, couldn't have meat or leather. Everything cascaded from hay harvest. You worked every hour of extended summer daylight, cutting, turning, drying, and storing hay. Your back ached constantly. Your hands developed calluses on calluses. You breathed hay dust until your lungs hurt. Simultaneously, you tended growing crops, weeded gardens, fished when possible. Fish was critical protein source, especially in Norway, where fishing supplemented inadequate agricultural production. Salmon, cod, herring, these were caught, eaten fresh, dried, salted, or fermented for winter storage. The work of preserving fish was skilled but unpleasant. Gutting, cleaning, salting, or hanging to dry in the wind and sun, fighting off flies and birds that wanted to feast on your winter stores. Autumn brought harvest, grain cut by hand with sickle, threshed by beating with flails, winnowed by tossing in the wind to separate grain from chaff. Every grain was precious. Dropping grain during harvest or threshing was waste you couldn't afford. Children gathered dropped grain, picking through stubble for individual kernels. The harvest determined whether you ate adequately or starved, whether animals survived winter, whether you could brew ale or make bread, whether you paid taxes and tithes or faced penalties. Bad harvest wasn't inconvenience. It was potential death sentence. The slaughter season began in autumn. Animals that couldn't be fed through winter were killed, a calculation made carefully because you needed enough animals to breed next generation but couldn't afford to feed animals that wouldn't survive or reproduce. The slaughter was bloody practical work. Throat cut, blood collected for blood pudding and sausages, animals skinned and butchered, every part used. Nothing was wasted because you couldn't afford waste. Hide became leather. Bones became tools, decorative items, or were boiled for marrow and nutrients. Intestines became sausage casings. Even hooves were boiled for glue. The preserved meat, salted, smoked, dried, joined other winter stores and outbuildings. Barrels of salted fish and meat, dried fish hanging from rafters, cheeses aging, grain stored in chests or pits, root vegetables in underground storage. These were the resources that had to last from autumn slaughter until spring, when cows might give milk again and gardens might produce. Running out of food before spring was ever-present threat. Famine was regular occurrence, not exceptional disaster. Winter was dark, cold, and confined. In the far north, the sun barely rose for months. You lived by firelight and the dim glow of oil lamps burning fish oil or animal fat. The cold was intense, temperatures well below freezing for months at a time. Your longhouse was insulated with turf walls and roof, heated by central fire, and crowded with people and animals. Cows and sheep might be brought inside for warmth, meaning you lived in literally with livestock. The warmth of bodies, human and animal, and the fire kept you from freezing, but it also meant the air was thick with smoke, moisture from breathing in animals, and various unpleasant smells. The diet in winter was monotonous and often inadequate. Preserved fish, preserved meat, when you could afford to eat it. Porridge made from grain, dried peas or beans, root vegetables, dairy products if cows were producing milk, ale to drink because water sources might be frozen or contaminated. Nutritional deficiencies were common. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C, rickets from lack of vitamin D due to absence of sunlight, anemia from iron-poor diet. You were hungry much of the time, not starving, but never quite full, always conserving stores and calculating how long supplies would last. Hygiene in winter was minimal. Bathing was rare. Heating water required fuel you couldn't spare, and exposing wet body to cold risked illness. You wore the same clothes for months, layers of wool and linen that trapped body heat, but also trapped sweat, skin cells, and parasites. Lice were universal. Everyone had them. You just tried to keep infestation manageable. Fleas from animals were constant companions. Your hair was probably matted and dirty. Your skin probably had various rashes and infections from inadequate washing. Disease spread easily in confined quarters. Respiratory infections passed from person to person in the crowded longhouse. Gastrointestinal illnesses from contaminated food or water could kill, especially children and elderly. Infections from wounds, even minor cuts, could become serious without antibiotics. Childbirth was dangerous for both mother and infant. Many children died before age 5, and many women died in childbirth or from complications afterward. Life expectancy was perhaps 40-50 years if you survived childhood, but many didn't. The religious life of Vikings was woven into daily existence rather than separated into designated worship times. You believed in gods like Odin, Thor, Freya, and others, but your relationship with them was transactional rather than devotional. You made offerings, food, drink, valuable objects, in exchange for protection, good harvests, success in endeavors. Small altars existed in homes and at significant landscape features, groves, unusual rock formations, springs. Major religious ceremonies happened at certain times of year, but daily religion was mostly about maintaining proper relationships with supernatural forces that controlled weather, crops, and fate. The concept of fate, weird in Old Norse, was central to Viking world view. Your fate was determined by the Norns, supernatural beings who wove the threads of death. This didn't mean passive acceptance, but rather courage in facing whatever fate brought. The emphasis was on reputation and legacy rather than on avoiding death, which was inevitable better to die with reputation for courage and honor than to live long as coward. This value system made sense in an environment where death was ever present and many things were beyond control. At least reputation was something you could influence through your actions. Burial practices reflected beliefs about afterlife. The dead were buried or cremated with grave goods, tools, weapons, jewelry, sometimes sacrificed animals, or even humans if the deceased was high status. These items were believed necessary in the afterlife. The wealthy might be buried in ships, either full-sized vessels or symbolic boat shapes outlined with stones. But for most people, burial was simpler, wrapped in cloth or placed in plain wooden coffin, buried with few grave goods because living needed resources more than dead. The archaeology shows stark differences in burial wealth, reflecting social stratification that existed in life and was projected into death. The work of textile production dominated women's lives and was more important than most modern people realize. Every piece of clothing everyone wore was handmade from scratch, starting with raw wool from sheep or flax grown for linen. The wool had to be cleaned, carded, spun into thread, dyed if color was desired, and woven into cloth. Then cloth had to be cut and sewn into garments. A single woolen tunic might represent 60-80 hours of work. A full set of clothing for one person for 1 year might represent 300-400 hours of labor. A family of 6 needed perhaps 2,000 hours of textile work annually just to maintain adequate clothing. This wasn't skilled craft done by a specialist, but everyday work done by all women and girls. You started learning to spin at age 5 or 6. By teenage years, you were expected to be a productive spinner, capable of producing thread for weaving. By adulthood, you could card wool, spin, dye, weave on vertical warp-weighted loom, and sew garments. These skills weren't optional accomplishments. They were basic survival skills like farming was for men. A woman who couldn't produce textiles efficiently was burdened on household. The weaving itself was done on large vertical looms that took up significant space in the longhouse. The loom stood against wall, with warp threads hanging vertically weighted by clay or stone weights, weft threads woven horizontally through warp. You worked standing, reaching up to work on upper portions of cloth, bending to work on lower portions. Your back, shoulders, and arms ached from repetitive motion. The work was meditative but also monotonous, threading the weft through warp threads thousands of times to create a single piece of cloth. Dyeing was skilled work that required knowledge of plants and mordants, substances that fixed dyes to fiber. Madder root produced red, woad produced blue. Various plants produced yellows and browns. The process was time-consuming and required precise control of temperature and timing. Expensive imported dyes, like true purple from shellfish, were available only to wealthy. For most people, natural brown wool and vegetable-dyed colors and earth tones were standard. The bright colors you see in some museum reproductions would have been luxury beyond most people's reach. The raiding that Vikings are famous for was actually minority activity engaged in by a small percentage of population. Most Vikings never raided anyone. They were farmers who spent their lives in Scandinavia growing barley and tending sheep. The men who did go raiding were typically younger sons without inheritance prospects, men from wealthy families who could afford equipment, or professional warriors in service to chieftains. The raids themselves were seasonal activity. You couldn't raid in winter when seas were too rough and you were needed on farm. You raided in summer, ideally returning in autumn to help with harvest. The motivation for raiding was primarily economic. Scandinavia was poor in resources compared to wealthier regions of Europe. Agricultural land was limited. Opportunities for advancement were constrained by inheritance customs, where eldest son typically inherited farm. Younger sons needed to find their own way, raiding, trading, hiring on as mercenaries, or trying to establish new farmsteads on marginal land. Raiding offered possibility of wealth, silver, slaves, valuable goods that couldn't be obtained at home. The reality of raiding was less glorious than mythology suggests. You traveled in open boats across often rough seas, exposed to weather, sleeping on beaches or in hastily constructed camps. You ate preserved food and whatever you could forage or steal. You risked death not just in combat, but from shipwreck, disease, or simply getting lost. The raids targeted monasteries and coastal settlements, partly because they were vulnerable, and partly because you wanted targets you could hit quickly and escape before organized resistance arrived. Pitched battles were risky and avoided when possible. Quick raids for portable wealth were the preference. The violence was real and brutal. Monasteries were targeted not because Vikings hated Christianity, but because they were wealthy and lightly defended. Monks were killed or enslaved. Religious objects were melted down for their gold and silver. Buildings were burned. Coastal villages were raided, people killed or taken as slaves, valuables seized. The victims experienced terror and devastation. The raiders experienced adrenaline, fear, and, if successful, profit. But many raids failed. Defenders fought back, weather destroyed ships, disease killed raiders, or simply the targeted location turned out to be poorer than expected. Slavery was integral to Viking economy and society. Slaves, thralls in Old Norse, were people captured in raids, children born to slave parents, or people who had sold themselves into slavery to pay debts or survive famine. Thralls did the most unpleasant work, heavy agricultural labor, mucking out animal pens, hauling water, any work that free people didn't want to do. They had no rights, could be bought and sold, and were completely dependent on owners' whim. Treatment varied. Some owners were relatively humane, others were brutal. But being a thrall meant your life wasn't your own. Your children would be slaves, and escape was nearly impossible in tight-knit communities where strangers were immediately noticed. The economics of slavery made sense to Vikings, even though we now recognize it as moral abomination. A thrall represented labor you didn't have to do, an economic surplus that could be extracted or sold. Archaeological evidence shows that thralls existed in significant numbers, possibly 10 to 25% of population in some areas. The sagas mention them casually, indicating their presence was normalized. The gradual Christianization of Scandinavia eventually contributed to slavery's decline, as Christian doctrine opposed enslaving fellow Christians. But this was process taking centuries, and slavery persisted well into the medieval period. Trade was more important to most Vikings than raiding, though less dramatic and thus less celebrated in sagas and modern imagination. Vikings were skilled sailors who established trade routes throughout Europe, down the rivers of Russia to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world, and across the Atlantic to Iceland, Greenland, and briefly North America. They traded furs, walrus ivory, amber, timber, and slaves for silver, silks, spices, wine, and other goods not available in Scandinavia. If you were merchant or part of trading expedition, you traveled in summer trading season, bringing goods that were valuable in foreign markets and returning with goods desired at home. The profit margins could be substantial if you survived the journey and found good market. But trading also involved risks: shipwreck, pirates, hostile markets, dishonest partners. The sagas tell stories of merchants who became wealthy through trade, but also merchants who lost everything and returned home in debt or didn't return at all. The social structure of Viking society was stratified but not rigidly hierarchical in the way feudal Europe was. At the top were jarls, nobles who owned substantial land, had many dependents, and wielded political and military power. Below them were carls, free farmers and craftspeople who owned land or practiced trades, had legal rights and social standing. At the bottom were thralls, slaves with no rights or property. But there was some mobility between carl and jarl status. Successful raiding, trading, or farming could elevate family status over generations, and failed families could decline. The Thing, assembly where free men met to make laws, resolve disputes, and make decisions affecting community, was central to Viking political culture. The Thing operated by consensus and custom, rather than written law codes. Though legal traditions were memorized and recited, cases were heard, evidence and witnesses were presented, judgment was rendered by assembly. Compensation for injuries was calculated based on complex system of vergild, the value of a person based on their status. Killing a jarl required higher compensation than killing a carl, and killing a thrall was minor offense requiring only replacement value to owner. But the Thing's egalitarian nature shouldn't be overstated. While free men theoretically had voice, in practice wealth and family connections determined whose voice carried weight. Powerful families dominated proceedings. Poor farmers might have legal rights but lacked resources to pursue cases against wealthy opponents. Women couldn't attend the Thing or speak in it directly, though they could pursue legal action through male relatives. The system was more participatory than monarchical feudalism, but still reflected and reinforced existing inequalities. Women's legal status in Viking society was complex, better than in some contemporary societies, worse than others. Women couldn't attend the Thing or hold public office, but they could own property, inherit, divorce husbands, and manage farms when men were away on trading expeditions or raids. A widow might run entire farmstead, making decisions about planting, animal management, and household economy. This practical authority didn't translate to political power, but it meant women weren't completely powerless within domestic sphere. Marriage was arranged by families and was primarily economic arrangement. Bride's family provided dowry, groom's family provided bride price. Marriage was formalized by contract and witnessed by community. Love might develop, but it wasn't prerequisite. The marriage's purpose was alliance between families, production of legitimate children, and economic partnership. Divorce was possible. Either spouse could divorce the other for specified reasons including sterility, abuse, or the other spouse cross-dressing, which suggests some Vikings did cross gender boundaries in ways community found objectionable enough to be grounds for divorce. Childbirth and child-rearing were women's sphere. Birth was attended by other women, experienced mothers and midwives who had practical knowledge but limited ability to intervene in complications. Maternal mortality was high, and infant mortality was staggering. Perhaps 30 40% of children died before age 5 from disease, accidents, exposure, or simple fragility. Parents loved their children but also had to guard emotional investment, knowing many children wouldn't survive. Children who survived infancy began working early. By age 6 or 7, they were doing age-appropriate labor, learning skills they'd need as adults. The naming patterns reveal values and hopes parents had for children. Children might be named after deceased relatives, maintaining family connection across generations. Names often incorporated elements referring to gods, animals, or desired qualities. Thor names were popular: Thorstein, Thorolf, invoking the god's strength. Wolf names suggested fierceness. Names like Astrid, God Beautiful, or Sigrid, Victory Beautiful, expressed hopes for daughters. But names couldn't protect against harsh realities of high mortality and limited resources. The shipbuilding that Vikings are famous for was skilled craft, requiring years of apprenticeship. Building a longship, the sleek vessels capable of crossing oceans and navigating shallow rivers, required selecting appropriate trees, splitting logs into planks using wedges and axes, shaping planks with careful precision, and assembling them in clinker-built technique where each plank overlapped the one below it. The ships were marvels of engineering, flexible enough to handle rough seas, but strong enough to carry substantial cargo and crews. But building ships was expensive and time-consuming. A longship might require thousands of hours of skilled labor and resources from dozens of trees. Only wealthy individuals or communities could afford to build and maintain ships. If you were ordinary farmer, you might own small fishing boat or share ownership of trading vessel with others. But ownership of raiding ship was beyond your means. This economic reality meant that participation in raids was limited to those with resources or connections to those with resources. Navigation at sea was skilled art based on observation and experience rather than instruments. Vikings navigated by sun, stars, landmarks, sea conditions, wildlife behavior, and accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. They had no compass, though they may have used sunstones, crystals that could locate sun even through clouds by detecting polarized light. They had no charts, though they certainly had mental maps of routes and hazards. Crossing open ocean to Iceland or Greenland required courage and skill. Storms could destroy ships, fog could disorient crews, miscalculation could leave you lost in vast ocean until food and water ran out. The settlement of Iceland starting around 870 CE shows both Viking exploration ability and the push factors driving expansion. Iceland was uninhabited, volcanic island with limited arable land and harsh climate. Yet thousands of Norwegians migrated there, establishing farmsteads and eventually a society with its own thing, the Alting, and distinctive culture. The migration was driven partly by political conflicts in Norway as kings centralized power, and partly by land hunger as population growth made farmland scarce. Iceland offered freedom from Norwegian kings, but demanded constant struggle against even harsher environment than Norway. The sagas, prose narratives written down in Iceland during 13th and 14th centuries, provide our richest literary sources about Viking Age, but they must be read critically. They were written 200, 300 years after the events they describe, by Christian authors looking back at pagan past, often with political or family agendas. They contain historical kernels, but also invented dialogue, legendary elements, and narrative shaping that makes them literature rather than pure history. The sagas tell us how later Icelanders wanted to remember the Viking Age which is valuable information but different from what actually happened. The sagas valorize certain behaviors: loyalty to family and friends, courage in battle, clever wordplay, generosity to guests, revenge for insults. But they also show that these values created problems. Family feuds could escalate into multi-generational bloodbaths. Emphasis on honor meant that minor slights required violent response, or else you'd be seen as coward. The sagas are full of intelligent people making terrible decisions because their value system required them to pursue revenge or defend honor even when pragmatism suggested compromise. The reality behind the sagas was probably more mundane than the narratives suggest. Most Vikings weren't eloquent poets composing verses before battle or cunning strategists plotting elaborate revenge. They were farmers who occasionally got into disputes with neighbors over property boundaries or livestock, who sometimes raided monasteries if opportunity arose, who mostly worried about harvest and survived by their wits and labor. The exceptional individuals who became saga heroes were exceptional precisely because they weren't typical. The gradual Christianization of Scandinavia transformed Viking culture over several centuries. Christian missionaries began arriving in 8th and 9th centuries, making some converts but facing resistance from those loyal to old gods. Kings who converted to Christianity often faced opposition from conservative elements in society. The conversion process was political as much as spiritual. Christian kingdoms of Europe were more willing to trade with and less likely to attack fellow Christians, creating incentives for conversion that had nothing to do with theological conviction. The methods of conversion varied. Some missionaries used persuasion and education. Some kings imposed Christianity by force, like Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, who reportedly tortured and killed those who refused baptism. Most conversion was probably pragmatic acceptance, motivated by political and economic advantages rather than spiritual revelation. The old gods didn't disappear immediately, but gradually faded as new generations were raised Christian and old practices were suppressed or reinterpreted. The transition created cultural hybridization. Pagan practices persisted under Christian veneer. Offerings at sacred sites continued, but were reinterpreted as Christian devotions. Old festivals were transformed into Christian holidays. The concept of Valhalla, where warriors who died in battle feasted with Odin, was reconceptualized in terms of Christian heaven, though Christian heaven's promise of peace was awkward fit for warriors expecting eternal combat and feasting. The conversion was process of negotiation and adaptation, rather than clean break from old to new. The end of Viking Age is typically dated to 1066 CE, the year of Battle of Stamford Bridge, where Norwegian King Harald Hardrada was killed attempting to conquer England, and Battle of Hastings, where Norman Duke William, himself descendant of Vikings who had settled in northern France, conquered England. These dates are convenient markers, but the end of Viking Age was a gradual process. The Scandinavian kingdoms became more centralized under Christian kings who built administrative structures modeled on European kingdoms. The raiding that had characterized the Viking Age declined as these kingdoms integrated into European diplomatic and trade networks. The decline wasn't because Vikings became less capable or brave. It was because circumstances changed. European kingdoms developed better defenses against raids. Monasteries fortified or relocated inland. Coastal towns built walls and maintained armed forces. The easy pickings of early Viking Age were gone. Simultaneously, opportunities for legitimate trade increased as Scandinavian kingdoms became recognized trading partners. Going raiding was riskier and less profitable than trading legally. The rational calculation shifted from raiding to trading, and Viking behavior adapted accordingly. The archaeological evidence from Viking Age sites reveals details of daily life that sagas We've
Don't
found
mention.
agricultural tools, cooking implements, spindle whorls, loom weights, gaming pieces, combs, keys, and countless other mundane objects. These artifacts tell us Vikings played board games like Nefatafel, cared about personal grooming enough to carry combs, secured their belongings with locks, and used similar tools for farming that farmers had been using for centuries and would continue using for centuries. The excavations at specific sites provide windows into particular moments in Viking Age. The settlement at Lons Meadows in Newfoundland, the only confirmed Viking site in North America, shows that Vikings briefly settled there around 1000 CE. The site has remains of 8 buildings including longhouses and workshops, evidence of iron production, and artifacts linking it to Norse culture. But the settlement was abandoned after only a few years, probably because it was too far from Greenland to supply easily, and relations with indigenous peoples were hostile. It represents furthest reach of Viking expansion and also its limits. They could get to North America, but couldn't maintain permanent presence there. The Oseberg ship burial in Norway, discovered in 1904, contained remarkably preserved ship and grave goods from 800 to 34 CE. 2 women, probably high-status individuals, possibly a queen and her servant, were buried in elaborately carved ship with tapestries, carved wooden objects, sleds, cart, and various household items. The burial goods show incredible craftsmanship and give us rare glimpse of high-status women's possessions. The textiles preserved in the burial show complex weaving patterns and fine workmanship. But this burial represents extreme wealth. Ordinary burials were far simpler and have yielded far less information. The trading town of Birka in Sweden provides evidence of Viking commercial activity. Located on island in Lake Mälaren, Birka was an important trading center from 8th to 10th century. Archaeological excavations have found evidence of craftspeople working with metals, glass, bone, and textiles. Imported goods from across Europe and beyond show extensive trade network. The town had perhaps 700,000 inhabitants at its peak, substantial for Viking Age, but tiny by modern standards. Most Vikings never saw a town of this size. Their world was isolated farmsteads and small settlements with perhaps a few dozen people. The daily routine on a farm varied by season, but followed predictable patterns. In summer, men woke early to let animals out to pasture, check on crops, perform maintenance on buildings and tools. Breakfast was simple: leftover porridge or bread with butter or cheese if available, perhaps dried fish. Then work began, farming tasks that varied by time and growing season. Midday meal was similarly simple. Work continued through long summer daylight. Evening meal was largest stew or porridge with whatever protein was available, bread, dairy products, ale to drink. After meal, there might be time for games, storytelling, or craft work before sleep. Women's routine overlapped with men's but focused on different tasks. You milked cows morning and evening, assuming cows were producing milk, which they didn't always do year-round. You collected eggs from chickens. You prepared meals, grinding grain, making bread, cooking stews, churning butter, making cheese. Between meals, You worked on textile production, always constantly, because textile work was never finished. You supervised children, managed household stores, organized food preservation. In autumn, you were involved in slaughtering and preserving meat for winter. Every task was labor-intensive without modern tools. The food preservation techniques that allowed survival through winter required significant effort and knowledge. Meat was salted, smoked, or dried. Fish were dried in wind, salted, or fermented. Grains were stored in dry conditions to prevent molding and pest infestation. Root vegetables were kept in underground pits or cellars. Dairy products were made into cheese that could be stored or butter that was salted. Fruits like apples or berries were dried. Nothing could be wasted because winter was long and supplies were limited. The fermentation of fish, particularly herring, produced surströmming-like products that were acquired taste but provided protein in winter when fresh fish wasn't available. The process involved salting fish and allowing controlled fermentation. The smell was intense and unpleasant to unfamiliar noses, but the result was preserved protein that wouldn't rot. Modern Scandinavians still eat fermented fish products, though now as cultural delicacy rather than necessity of winter survival. The brewing of ale was regular household task primarily done by women. Ale was made from malted barley, flavored with various herbs before hops became standard flavoring. The brewing process was fairly simple, but required timing and attention. The result was mildly alcoholic beverage that was safer to drink than water, provided calories and nutrients, and was consumed daily by everyone including children. Stronger ale was brewed for feasts and special occasions. The quality of your brewing affected households' reputation. Hospitality required offering guests ale, and poor ale reflected badly on household. The feast culture that sagas emphasized did exist, but was occasional rather than daily. When chieftain held feast, it was display of wealth and generosity. Large amounts of meat were served, whole animals roasted, stews with generous portions, luxury foods like imported wine or spices for wealthy hosts. Ale flowed freely. Poetry might be recited, stories told, games played. Feasts were opportunities to cement alliances, settle disputes, and demonstrate status. But for ordinary farmers, feasts were rare events you might attend once or twice a year at most. Daily meals were far simpler. The skaldic poetry that Vikings composed was sophisticated art form with complex meters and extensive use of kennings, metaphorical compound expressions where whale road meant sea, battle sweat meant blood, raven feeder meant warrior. Learning to compose and recite this poetry required years of practice and good memory. Skalds, professional poets, composed praise poems for chieftains and kings, verses about battles and heroes, and occasionally satirical verses criticizing enemies. Being good skald brought status and patronage. But most Vikings weren't skalds and couldn't compose complex poetry. Though they might know and recite traditional poems, the runestones erected throughout Scandinavia provide contemporary evidence of Viking age concerns and values. Most runestones commemorate dead individuals, often specifying their relationship to the person who erected the stone. Bali raised this stone in memory of Assur, his brother, a very good Thagan, his typical inscription. The stones tell us Vikings valued family relationships, military service, and being remembered after death. Some stones mention pilgrimage to Jerusalem or death in Greece in service to Byzantine emperor, showing the geographical range of Viking activity. The stones are evidence of literacy spreading during Viking Age, though still limited to a small minority of population. The runes themselves, the writing system Vikings used, were adapted from earlier Germanic alphabets and consisted of 16 characters in the younger Futhark version, most common in Viking Age. Runes were carved into wood, stone, bone, and metal. They were angular characters designed to be carved rather than written, with pen and ink. Learning runes was skill possessed primarily by specialized runestone carvers and some wealthy individuals. Most Vikings couldn't read or write, depending on memory and oral transmission for preserving information. The cosmology that Vikings believed in was rich with gods, giants, dwarves, elves, and various supernatural beings. The 9 worlds connected by world tree Yggdrasil formed complex universe. Midgard was human world, surrounded by ocean, where world serpent Jormungandr. Asgard was realm of gods. Hell was realm of the dead, not necessarily punishment, just where dead people went who didn't die in battle. This cosmology provided framework for understanding natural phenomena and human fate. But how deeply most Vikings engaged with this mythology versus simply observing rituals and customs is unclear. The concept of honor, personal reputation, was crucial to Viking identity and caused significant problems. Honor was collective as well as individual. Your family's reputation affected you, and your actions affected family's reputation. Insults required response, or else your reputation suffered. This created cycles of revenge that sagas chronicle extensively. Someone kills your relative. You're obligated to seek revenge. Their family seeks revenge for that killing, and feud escalates until either both families are devastated or some settlement is reached. The thing could adjudicate disputes and set compensation, but accepting compensation rather than pursuing revenge could be seen as cowardly. The weaponry that Vikings used was expensive and thus status marker. A good sword was a valuable object that might be passed down through generations and even given a name. Swords were pattern-welded, layers of different types of iron forged together, creating distinctive patterns, and required considerable skill to make. Most warriors couldn't afford swords and used axes, spears, or knives instead. The famous Viking axe was a practical agricultural tool that could also be weapon. Shields were round wooden boards with metal boss in center, relatively inexpensive compared to swords, but still requiring resources to produce. The armor that wealthy warriors wore included chain-mail shirts, extremely expensive items requiring thousands of interlocking metal rings, each made individually. Most warriors had no armor beyond their shields. Some wore leather or quilted fabric that provided minimal protection. Helmets were conical metal or leather caps. No horns, despite popular image. The lack of armor for most warriors meant that combat was deadly. Unarmored human bodies are vulnerable to swords, axes, and spears. Battle survival often depended on shield skill and luck as much as combat prowess. The training for combat that young men received was informal compared to later medieval knightly training. You practiced with weapons as part of growing up, learning from father or other male relatives. Wrestling and swimming were valued skills, but there was no systematic military training regimen. Most Vikings who fought did so infrequently, defending against raids, occasional participation in raiding, or fighting in disputes between chieftains. Professional warriors who fought regularly were minorities serving as retainers to wealthy jarls or kings. The ships that allowed Viking expansion were built in different sizes for different purposes. Long ships used for raiding were narrow, shallow draft vessels designed for speed and ability to navigate rivers and land on beaches. They were crewed by warriors who also rowed 30 to 60 oarsmen, depending on ship size. Cargo ships called nars were wider and deeper, built to carry goods rather than warriors. They had smaller crews and relied more on sail than oars. Most Vikings who traveled by sea were on trading vessels, not raiding ships. The raiders were minority, the most historically visible minority. The navigation techniques mentioned earlier deserves elaboration. Vikings memorized routes and landmarks, distinctive mountains, islands, coastal features. They noted watercolor and temperature changes indicating currents. They observed wildlife. Certain birds indicated proximity to land. They measured latitude by observing sun's height at noon. The sagas mention using sun compass, device that might have been simple wooden disc marked to track sun's position, allowing estimation of direction even when sun was partially obscured. Recent experiments have shown that Iceland spar crystals can indeed locate sun through clouds by detecting polarized light, possibly confirming saga references to sunstones. The analysis of human remains shows what life did to Viking bodies. Skeletons show evidence of hard labor, arthritis in joints from repetitive motion, compression fractures in spines from heavy lifting, dental problems from gritty diet, injuries from accidents and violence. Some skulls show evidence of trepanation. Holes drilled in skull, presumably to treat head injuries or relieve pressure, with enough healing to show some patients survived the procedure. Average height was perhaps 5'7" for men and 5'2" for women, shorter than modern Scandinavians due to nutritional stress. The grave goods show social stratification. Wealthy burials included weapons, jewelry, sometimes ships, and sacrificed slaves. Poor burials had minimal grave goods or none. The richest burials, like Oseberg's ship burial in Norway with elaborately carved ship and rich grave goods, represent tiny elite. Most people were buried much more simply, reflecting their modest status in life. The archaeology confirms what written sources suggest, that Viking society was hierarchical with significant inequality in wealth and status. The environmental evidence shows how Vikings affected the landscapes they inhabited. In Iceland, deforestation began almost immediately after settlement, as trees were cut for building material, charcoal for metalworking, and firewood. Sheep grazing prevented forest regeneration. Within a few centuries, Iceland was largely treeless, and soil erosion became a serious problem that continues today. In Greenland, Norse settlers struggled to maintain European agricultural practices in an environment that couldn't support them, contributing to eventual abandonment of settlements. The Vikings weren't living in harmony with nature but actively transforming environments, sometimes in ways that proved unsustainable. The modern romanticization of Vikings as fearless warriors and bold explorers obscures the reality that most Vikings were farmers struggling to survive in harsh environment. The valorization of raiding ignores that Vikings were both perpetrators and victims of violence. Norwegian kings raided each other's territories. Danish Vikings raided Norway and Sweden. Everyone raided the Slavic peoples to the east. The image of Vikings as egalitarian and free ignores that their society practiced slavery extensively and was stratified by wealth and status like most pre-modern societies. The influence of 19th century nationalism on Viking historiography was particularly distortive. As Scandinavian nations developed national identities, they looked to Viking Age as heroic past that could inspire national pride. Vikings were reframed as embodiments of national character, bold, independent, democratic. This romantic nationalism created popular image of Vikings that has little to do with historical reality, but everything to do with modern nationalism's need for inspiring origin stories. The horned helmets that Vikings never actually wore became iconic specifically because they looked dramatic and distinctive in nationalist art. The reality was that Vikings were people, not better or worse than other people of their era, but human, with human strengths and weaknesses. They developed sophisticated shipbuilding and navigation skills because geography pushed them to master the sea. They raided because they lived in resource-poor region and raiding was profitable when it worked. They traded because trade was often more profitable than raiding and certainly safer. They farmed because most people in agricultural societies farm. It's how you eat. They practiced slavery because most pre-modern societies practiced slavery and didn't question its morality. The day-to-day existence of farming, textile production, food preservation, animal husbandry, and simple survival was what occupied most Vikings most of the time. The raids that make history exciting were seasonal activities engaged in by minority of population. The exploration that seems adventurous to us was dangerous necessity for people seeking better opportunities than crowded homeland offered. The violence that seems shocking to us was normal for era when state monopoly on violence didn't exist, and personal revenge was accepted method of justice. For the individual Viking, whose name we'll never know, whose specific story is lost, life meant waking before dawn to tend animals, working all day at agricultural tasks, eating simple food, sleeping in smoky longhouse crowded with family and animals, hoping harvest would be adequate, fearing illness and injury that could kill or cripple, finding small pleasures in occasional feast or successful hunt or moment of companionship. Your concerns were immediate, not legacy or historical reputation, but getting through season, keeping family fed, maintaining farm, fulfilling obligations to Jarl and community. You didn't think of yourself as Viking. That term is modern historical label. You were Norwegian, Danish, or Swedish, from specific region and family, with specific loyalties and obligations. Your identity was local and kinship-based rather than ethnic or national in modern sense. You knew stories of gods and heroes, participated in religious rituals, observed customs that connected you to ancestors, but you also adapted to circumstances, made pragmatic decisions, and focused on survival rather than living up to mythical ideals. The archaeological and historical evidence reveals that Viking Age Scandinavia was a region of agricultural communities, small-scale chiefdoms, and decentralized political structures. Kings existed, but their power was limited by geography and by tradition of thing-based decision-making. Most political authority was local. Jarls who controlled regions, thing assemblies that made decisions for communities. The centralization into kingdoms was a gradual process happening during and after Viking Age, driven partly by need to organize defense and partly by influence of Christian European monarchical models. The economy was primarily subsistence agriculture supplemented by fishing, hunting, limited craft production, and for some, raiding or trading. Wealth was measured in land, livestock, silver, and slaves. Coinage existed, but most transactions used barter or hack silver. Silver cut into pieces and weighed for payment. The sophisticated market economy of later medieval Europe didn't exist yet. You produced most of what you consumed, traded surplus when possible, and participated in gift economy, where generosity created social obligations and relationship. The legacy of Viking age to modern world is mixed and often misunderstood. Vikings influenced the genetic and linguistic heritage of regions they settled. Northern Britain, Ireland, parts of France, they established trade routes that connected distant regions. They provided military service as mercenaries and established kingdoms in conquered territories. But their cultural impact was often absorbed and transformed by larger Christian European civilization they encountered. The Normans who conquered England in 1066 were descendants of Vikings, but culturally French. The Rus, who established kingdoms in Eastern Europe, were Scandinavian in origin, but became Slavic in culture. The modern fascination with Vikings reflects contemporary concerns more than historical reality. Vikings appear in popular culture as rebels against civilization, strong individuals unconstrained by social convention, bold adventurers seeking glory. This image appeals to modern audiences who value individualism and adventure. But it has little to do with historical Vikings who were constrained by social conventions, concerned primarily with survival, and embedded in complex web of kinship obligations and social hierarchies. The white supremacist appropriation of Viking imagery is particularly perverse distortion. Vikings raided and traded throughout Europe, Mediterranean, Middle East, and even reached North America. They were cosmopolitan traders who cared about profit, not racial purity. Their society included slaves of diverse origins and intermarried with populations they settled among. The idea that Vikings represent racial purity is modern racist invention with no historical basis. So the next time you encounter Viking imagery in popular culture, the fearless warriors, the bold explorers, the supposed freedom lovers, remember the farmer waking before dawn to milk cows, the woman spinning thread until her fingers cramped, the child dying at age 3 from disease, the slave working without hope of freedom, the winter hunger that made everyone count remaining stores and pray for spring. Remember that most Vikings never raided anyone, that exploration was desperate search for better opportunities, that freedom was constrained by obligations and limited resources. Life as Viking wasn't adventure, but struggle. The courage wasn't in seeking glory, but in facing each day's necessities without giving up. The achievement wasn't conquering distant lands, but surviving another year in harsh climate with limited resources. The legacy isn't fearless warriors, but farmers, craftspeople, sailors, and traders who adapted to circumstances and created culture that valued practical skills, valued reputation and community, and found ways to mark both mundane existence and occasional drama with stories and rituals that gave meaning to hard lives. The Vikings who lived ordinary lives, who never raided, never explored distant lands, never achieved fame, were majority and represent what Viking age actually was. Farming communities in difficult environment, making do with limited resources, adapting to circumstances, maintaining traditions while slowly changing, living and dying without individual records, but leaving collective impact in genes, languages, and scattered artifacts that archaeologists excavate. The interaction with other cultures through trade and raid brought Vikings into contact with civilizations more technologically advanced in some respects. In Constantinople, Vikings serving as Varangian guard in Byzantine emperor's service encountered urban civilization on scale they'd never seen in Scandinavia. The city had perhaps 400,000 inhabitants, more people than in all of Norway. It had stone buildings, sophisticated administration, literate culture, and wealth beyond Viking imagination. The Vikings who served there and returned home brought back not just silver, but ideas and exposure to different ways of organizing society. This contact contributed to transformation of Scandinavian societies toward more centralized kingdoms and eventual Christianization. The amber from Baltic shores was valuable trade commodity that Vikings controlled access. Amber was prized for jewelry and carved objects throughout Europe and Mediterranean. Vikings gathered amber from beaches and traded it south for silver, weapons, luxury goods. This trade gave them economic importance beyond their population size. Control of trade routes, both overland through what is now Russia and by sea around Europe, made certain Viking chieftains wealthy and powerful. Trade was often more lucrative than raiding and certainly more sustainable long-term. The encounters with Islamic world through trade routes down Russian rivers brought Vikings to markets in Baghdad and other Middle Eastern cities. Archaeological finds in Scandinavia include coins, silver jewelry, and other artifacts from Islamic civilization. Arab writers described Viking traders, noting their height, their tattoos, their grooming habits, which Arabs found excessive. Vikings apparently bathed and combed their hair more than was common in Middle East. These cross-cultural contacts show that Vikings were integrated into broader medieval world economy, not isolated in northern periphery. The women who managed households while men were away on trading voyages or raids had significant responsibility and authority. You might run entire farm for months or years if husband was gone. This practical authority didn't translate to formal political power, but it meant you made economic decisions, managed laborers and slaves, negotiated with neighbors, and maintained families' position. The sagas include examples of strong-willed women who took decisive action, sometimes violent action, to protect family interests. While literary depictions may exaggerate, they reflect reality that Viking women had more practical autonomy than women in many contemporary societies. The difference between male and female grave goods reveals gendered division of labor. Men's graves often contain weapons, tools for metalworking or woodworking, gaming pieces. Women's graves contain keys, symbolizing household authority, spindle whorls and weaving tools, brooches, and jewelry. The keys are particularly telling. They were functional objects that locked storage chests containing household valuables, but they also symbolized women's role as household managers. Being buried with keys indicated your status as person who controlled household resources. The genetic and linguistic legacy of Viking expansion is still visible today. Iceland's population is descended primarily from Norwegian settlers and Irish slaves they brought with them. The dialects of northern England contain numerous Old Norse words that entered English through Viking settlement in the Danelaw. Place names throughout areas Vikings settled preserved Norse linguistic elements. The by endings in English place names come from Old Norse byr, meaning farm or settlement. The genetic signature of Scandinavian ancestry is detectable in populations descended from areas Vikings settled or raided extensively. The climate during Viking Age was slightly warmer than medieval period that followed. The medieval warm period made Greenland marginally more habitable and allowed grain cultivation at higher latitudes. This favorable climate contributed to Viking expansion, but it also meant that when climate cooled during Little Ice Age, starting around 1300 CE, settlements that had been viable became marginal or impossible. The Norse settlements in Greenland were abandoned by 1450s, probably due to combination of climate cooling, soil erosion, conflict with Inuit peoples, and declining trade contacts with Iceland and Norway. The question of why Viking Age ended when it did involves multiple factors. Christianization changed value systems. Christian ethics disapproved of raiding fellow Christians, though this didn't stop all violence. Centralization of kingdoms meant that independent raiding by opportunistic warriors became harder. Kings wanted to control violence and direct it toward their purposes. Improved defenses in European kingdoms meant raiding was riskier and less profitable. Trade opportunities increased as Scandinavian kingdoms integrated into European economic networks. The constellation of factors that made Viking raiding profitable and feasible in 9th and 10th centuries had changed by 11th century, and Viking behavior adapted. The transformation from Viking Age Scandinavia to Christian medieval kingdoms took several generations and wasn't always peaceful. Old gods didn't disappear overnight. Practices persisted in rural areas long after official conversion. The boundary between pagan and Christian was often blurred. People might be baptized but still make offerings at sacred groves, observe Christian festivals but maintain older customs. Religion was as much about community practice and tradition as about theological beliefs. The conversion was a negotiated process, where new religion gradually displaced old through combination of political pressure, economic incentives, and cultural change. And so ends our journey through Viking daily life. If you enjoyed this exploration of reality behind mythology, subscribe for more journeys revealing historical truths. Leave a comment telling me which aspect of Viking life surprised you most, or suggest another historical topic you'd like me to explore. Sleep well, time traveler, and maybe tonight, appreciate that your survival doesn't depend on single season's harvest, that you can read about the past because literacy isn't rare skill, that your social status isn't determined entirely by birth, that you have medical care beyond herb lore and luck, and that the ordinary struggles of daily life, however challenging, probably don't include literal starvation as regular. Appreciate that you can admire Viking craftsmanship and courage without romanticizing the harsh realities of their existence or projecting modern values onto people who lived by different rules in different circumstances. Sweet dreams.